My name is Krista Lavoie, and I am a junior here at Hillsdale from Spokane, Washington, studying psychology and German. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you today's speaker, John Marini. Dr. John Marini is a professor of political science at the University of Nevada-Reno, a former visiting distinguished fellow at Hillsdale's Allan P. Kirby Junior Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship in Washington, D.C. Dr. Marini earned his BA at San Jose State University and his Ph.D. in government at the Claremont Graduate School. He serves on the board of directors at the Claremont Institute, which awarded him his Henry Salvatori Prize in the American founding in 2011. Dr. Marini served in the Reagan administration as a special assistant to Justice Clarence Thomas, who was then chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He is the author of numerous popular and scholarly articles in politics, political theory, and film, especially the films of John Ford. He is the author or editor of several books, including The Imperial Congress, Crisis in the Separation of Powers, and The Political Budget Control, Congress, the Presidency, and the Growth of the Administration State. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Marini.
Well, thank you, Krista, for the introduction. Thank all of you for coming on a nice day like this. I thought many of you would be out golfing or something. Hillsdale is a special place. It's always a privilege to come here. And I was just thinking about the first time I came here, which was about 30 years ago when I gave a talk on the scandal of that day. This was the end of the Reagan administration. I gave a talk on the Iran-Contra affair. So the scandals haven't disappeared. I mean, it seems like they've been raised to a higher art form in Washington in the last 30 years. But it's a real pleasure to be here. What is interesting about this view of scandals in this conference is we heard some very different interpretations of those famous scandals in American history that have been treated in the history books and in the popular culture as fully understood and fairly resolved. Whether they have been fully and factually, let alone truthfully understood, is another question. If you heard Jeff Shepard's talk last night, you know that there was much about Watergate we never knew at the time. Perhaps what we know about the infamous scandals of the past is not determined by what actually happened, but the way in which the most influential intellectual and political elites have come to accommodate and explain what they themselves have created as a crisis of the political order. Is such scandal meant to expose corruption, or is it meant to derail and obscure a new political reality that appears to be beyond their control? If so, perhaps they do so in order to elevate scandal and attempt to define its political meaning for the purpose of preserving the old order. The difficulty of interpreting any complex historical event, present or past, is not a new one. This dilemma was revealed very well fictionally by the editor of a newspaper in the great Western movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Faced with the necessity of deciding whether to publish the truth of an explosive political story, the editor justified his refusal to do so by insisting, and I quote, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." I'm afraid we are the beneficiaries of many printed and celluloid legends when it comes to the interpretation of great political events, especially scandals. That is because the events that give rise to scandal are complicated by the political, bureaucratic, economic, and social interests of those whose motives are rarely revealed. Consequently, scandal becomes a viable option for those partisans who think they will be at a disadvantage in a new and unknown political environment. that may be beyond their control. Rather than revealing truth or exposing corruption, most great scandals arise as a means of obscuring the political reality that has grown out of irreconcilable political or policy differences. The greatest likelihood of serious scandal arises in the aftermath of a critical or transformative election. Such elections attempt to alter the political landscape by attempting to create a new political consensus that renders the policy-making authority of the old order obsolete. The defenders of the old order are not above using any means, including scandal, to undermine the illegal authority of the civic office holder and dilute the moral authority of the electorate as well. It is not accidental, therefore, that nearly every political scandal, sooner or later, is transformed into a legal drama. It then becomes one that can be and is meant to be understood in purely personal or nonpartisan legal terms. It is an attempt to subordinate politics to law and partisanship to the neutrality of the non-political institutions. Although it is deliberately fought out in the public stage, and it may affect policies in a decisive manner, the legal focus and the decision-making process is placed in the hands of bureaucracies and courts. It's taken out of the hands of the electorate. Consequently, a partisan victory can be obtained by successful prosecution of apparently corrupt office holders. It can be and is justified politically and morally as upholding the rule of law, presupposes the absolute incorruptibility of the permanent government. Although it provides clarity in terms of simplifying the issues in a manner suitable for presentation to a mass public, it obscures the deeper, more fundamental problems that give rise to the perceived necessity of political scandal. Nearly every political administration, every presidential administration has potential scandal that lies just below the surface of public life. They rarely erupt into full-blown crisis of the political order. What provides the occasion for those few scandals that become political earthquakes? In simple terms, you could say that political scandal can always arise because of the ongoing necessity of exposing scoundrels in the political world. There are always those in government who seek to profit privately from public service, and also there are those who attempt or are thought to undermine the legitimacy of government by abusing their power. Clearly, nearly all governments in all times provide the occasion for scoundrels of both kinds. But political scandal, although an ever-present possibility in government, is especially important in government in which public opinion often determines what can or cannot be done politically. Scandal can be used to establish the legitimacy of the opposition or delegitimize those who hold elective office in the government. However, it is almost always a tool that remains in the hands of the so-called neutral or nonpartisan apparatus of the permanent government. That means it is primarily within the domain controlled by the bureaucracy or the courts of law. Legal tactics can succeed if those nonpartisan institutions are thought to be beyond reproach. They must retain public confidence in their partisan neutrality, that all partisans will be treated equally. In short, the permanent government must be thought to be incorruptible and above politics. But I think, as we've seen in these past days, it's difficult to deny that any of the great scandals in American history can be understood as above politics. Trying to understand this dilemma, the interesting question is why the potential for serious scandal results in a political firestorm only when there are significant moral or political moral and political, or policy differences that cannot be resolved in a or a constitutional manner, really. Perhaps we can say, following Clausewitz, that scandal, like war, provides the occasion for politics by other means. The goal of those who rely on scandal to deter or defeat their political and institutional opponents is to obscure from public consideration the policy differences that have become irreconcilable within the political structure. Moreover, it is tacit admission that those who use scandal no longer believe they have the ability politically to influence future policy making. When the political climate is no longer hospitable to the preservation of their public and private interests, they can turn to those so-called nonpartisan or neutral elements of the permanent government itself. Then the bureaucracy and courts can be used to focus the issue in such a way as to mobilize and influence public opinion on behalf of a political agenda that remains hidden. In a constitutional regime where political authority establishes the legal authority of the non-political branches, it is the public alone that determines who will hold office and exercise political authority. In undermining that political authority, the authority of the people in elections, scandal is one way in which the bureaucracy, courts, and weaker partisans can triumph in the political arena, even in the face of an overwhelming political victory in the electoral arena. The political fate of Richard Nixon revealed the manner in which modern political scandal would come to be used for partisan purposes. It provided the model for all subsequent use of political scandal. Nixon won an electoral victory of monumental proportions in 1972, yet he was removed from office within the following year or so. Despite the spectacle of Watergate and the mobilization of political passion against Nixon, there was very little real political or partisan activity in defense of Nixon. How is it possible to mobilize political support within the party or the electorate for a trial that is in the secret hands of prosecutors, grand juries, and judges? In 1974, we never had any indication that those institutions could be corrupted as well. If Jeff Shepard is right, they were. Nixon, of course, being political, believed he had partisan enemies trying to destroy him. But even his Republican supporters in Congress came to accept Watergate primarily in legal terms. The most famous line of a Nixon defender, Senator Howard Baker, was, "What did the president know, and when did he know it?" In such circumstances, Nixon was forced to make a legal defense of his office. What was surprising then and now is how little disagreement there was concerning the political meaning of Watergate. It was and remains the political scandal by which all scandal is measured. It was a crisis that undermined the political authority of the president, while at the same time increasing the administrative authority of the executive branch. Not surprisingly, the intellectual elites of both parties, liberals and conservatives, had come to agree that Richard Nixon was the problem. His removal was meant to bring about the solution to a crisis of democratic government posed by the executive abuse of power. They succeeded in removing Nixon. They also succeeded in empowering Congress and the bureaucracy. The personal and legal details of Watergate as cover-up are well known in the popular culture. Some of these things are still being discovered, as we noticed last night. But what were the political consequences of Watergate? The political fortunes of Congress and the presidency were dramatically reversed. As the editors of the Congressional Quarterly noted in their review of the 93rd Congress, which I'll read, Quote, when the 93rd Congress first convened in January 1973, after this great electoral victory of Nixon, President Nixon's sweeping assertions of executive authority posed a threat to the viability of the legislative branch. That was perceived by the legislature. Remember, it's in the hands of Democrats, all of the legislature. Even as Congress braced for confirmation with Nixon over spending, war powers, and other issues, its defiance was tempered by doubts as to whether it was indeed any match for the newly reelected president. But by the time Congress adjourned on December 20, 1974, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Both Nixon and Agnew had been driven from office in disgrace, replaced by men whom Congress had a hand in selecting. Remember, there was no election for Gerald Ford. He was the minority leader, the Republican leader in the House. So Congress really selected the next president. Meanwhile, last quote, meanwhile, moving into a vacuum created by the disintegration of executive leadership, Congress had staked out a commanding role for itself. And it became one of the great administrators of the executive branch. The way it organized and established its control over the executive branch. Now, that view of Nixon and the popular understanding of Watergate as the greatest constitutional crisis of all time remains unshaken after more than 40 years. I was not convinced then, or now, that the crisis could be understood as purely personal or strictly legal. As I noted before, nearly every presidential administration has potential scandal that lies just below the surface of public or political life. They rarely erupt into a full-blown crisis of the political order. The danger Nixon posed to the political establishment after his reelection was that he promised to use the power of the executive branch in a way that threatened to undermine the power of the newly created centralized administrative apparatus and thwart its relationship with Congress, the bureaucracy, and the courts. I thought at the time that it could not be Richard Nixon alone who made it impossible to establish a consensus on fundamental issues in American politics. Rather, it was precisely the inability to prevent such political disagreement between the parties and the branches of government that made Watergate possible. In fact, it might have been necessary for the defenders of the modern administrative state. Why did the political branches and parties diverge in such a manner as to make it impossible for them to pursue a common good in tandem? What was at stake was not merely the prerogative of the branches or the protection of partisan differences. Rather, what made consensus impossible was a disagreement over what constituted a fundamentally good or just regime. Was the modern administrative state, that progressive innovation that took shape in the New Deal and was greatly expanded in the Great Society, more fundamentally just than the political structures that had been established centuries before in the Constitution itself? The existence of parties indicates that differences of opinion have existed since the beginning of the Republic concerning the constitutionality of specific policies. Political quarrels were channeled into defense of constitutional prerogatives. But the ground of any civil disputation was that the comprehensive goodness or justice of the Constitution was beyond dispute. What lies at the heart of the contemporary debate is that the principal differences between the parties are no longer disputes concerning the constitutionality of politics, but a disagreement concerning the justice of constitutionalism itself. The rational policies adopted by the administrative state, such as absolute economic social regulation, establishment of the various security needs, all of those things that establish that are established by the modern administrative state establish the political and moral justification for the government itself. It denies the fundamental presupposition of constitutionalism, which is that the power of government must be limited and its scope confined to the protection of the political or natural rights of its citizens. The political essence of the Constitution was not contained merely in its written language, but in the political structure, which required a separation of powers and the branches of government. It was the constitutional principle of separation of powers that had come to be undermined by the growth of the administrative state. The Great Society had changed the institutional dynamic of Washington politics. After the election of 1964, both political branches participated in establishing greater political power in Washington by expanding and centralizing administrative authority in the executive branch bureaucracy. That centralization of administrative authority created a political reaction in the electorate that began the process of undermining the policies that were established in the wake of the 1964 election. The Republican Party, led by Richard Nixon, established itself as the partisan opponent of centralized administration. Although Nixon's first term required political concessions that often necessitated the expansion of federal powers, it was done primarily in order to garner support for the Vietnam War in a Congress composed overwhelmingly controlled by the opposition party. Now, those of you that are too young, although I know many of you remember what 1968 was like, that was a year of tremendous upheaval in America. Riots, assassinations. We had 500,000 troops in Vietnam when Nixon took office. 300 to 400 body bags were coming back to America every week, and television was showing the war in Vietnam on the nightly news. So Nixon's preoccupation in that first term had to be with foreign policy. But Nixon's second term was not a continuation of the first. Even the New York Times noted that that transformation demanded by Nixon of his administration after his reelection was as extreme as if an opposition party had won the election. Now, some of you may remember, Nixon demanded every executive in his administration submit their resignation. That included even Henry Kissinger and the bigwig, because Nixon was saying he's tired of appointing people to these offices and then they become tools of the bureaucracy. So after Nixon's reelection in 1972, he posed a serious threat to the authority and power of the bureaucracy and the administrative state. But look at what happened with the scandal. His electoral victory would not turn out to be the determining factor that would shape the political landscape of the future, one that had been legitimized by the people themselves. Politics after Nixon was shaped by his opponents, who had merely to remove Nixon from office, and even without the necessity of impeachment. This is why the constitutional way is always preferable. He should have been, if there was wrongdoing, he should have been impeached. If he had been impeached, the kind of thing that Jeff Shepard was talking about last night could not have happened, because both sides would publicly reveal what they were doing. That didn't happen in Watergate with the special prosecutor. Now, although the inability to accommodate the differences between Nixon and his opponents involved a deeper intellectual or theoretical disagreement, as I mentioned before, the difference between a moral acceptance of the Constitution or its rejection by those who accept the administrative state as establishing moral authority. So there was a theoretical or an intellectual disagreement that lay below the surface of the political, but it revealed itself as a political problem during the second Nixon term. Far from being personal or a legal problem, it was political to the core. As Henry Kissinger subsequently noted, and I'll just quote from him, Nixon, this is a quote, in the final analysis had provoked a revolution. He had been reelected by a landslide in 1972 in a contest as close to being fought on ideological issues as is possible in America. The American people for once had chosen on philosophic grounds, not on personality. For reasons unrelated to the issues and unforeseeable by the people who voted for what Nixon represented, this choice was now being annulled with, as yet, unpredictable consequences. Well, we witnessed the consequences of it. It's still a decisive event in how all of politics was shaped after 1974. It was after the Nixon presidency that the Washington establishment thought it necessary to turn to the question of ethics in politics. In 1978, in the wake of Watergate, Congress passed the Ethics in Government Act. However, that law, which created the independent counsel statute, was intended to serve a partisan and not a constitutional purpose. The partisan purpose, which it served quite well, was the defense of the centralized administrative structure put in place by the Democratic Party majorities in the 60s and 70s. On the other hand, it had the effect of weakening the president's political control of the executive branch, well, as I said before, at the same time strengthening the administrative authority of the executive branch. It was the legislative majority's way of dealing with presidents and senior executive branch officials who might undermine or threaten the role of Congress in managing and exercising control over the sprawling executive branch administration. It sought to prevent unified presidential control of the executive branch. That could only be done by making high-level executive branch officials accountable to committee and subcommittee chair or the bureaucracy in the courts. Although it was defended on the ground that executive discretion must be subordinate to law, its political purpose was to institutionalize a defense of the permanent government, one that is not subject to political control. In fact, it allows the nonpartisan or neutral mechanism of the administrative state, the bureaucracy and courts, to establish the permanent government as the arbiter of the political world. We see this very clearly by the 2016 election, where those in the bureaucracy, and it doesn't matter where they stand in the bureaucracy, have a proprietary interest over the government and even determine whether or not somebody's fit for the office or not. So why had it suddenly become necessary to establish an independent prosecutor or special counsel in order to adjudicate the abuses of presidential authority? In utilizing non-political entities, the Justice Department, courts, and law enforcement, the permanent government created a legal arbiter of the political process with significant power. As a former prosecutor has written recently, the Department of Justice is an institution vested with formidable resources, including its authority over the FBI. It is also often the beneficiary of thinly veiled yet presumed allegiance with most of the federal courts in which its attorneys operate. As a result, and given enough time, in most cases, the Department of Justice is empowered via favorable rulings and otherwise to access, manipulate, and maneuver the federal laws, rules, regulations, and procedures, not to mention witness testimony, in whatever way it may deem necessary to ultimately bring most of those it targets to heel, perhaps even including a president. For nearly 190 years, there was no legal mechanism that was deliberately placed outside the political and legal authority granted by the Constitution to the political branches themselves. That document had carefully established a political doctrine. It assumed that all serious disputes would be political in character, and each of the branches would defend the interests of their respective institutions. They assumed the motives of all of the participants would involve self-interest and would consist, therefore, of differences of opinion concerning both the private and public good. In such circumstances, when all of the opinions of all of the participants are necessarily political, the founders thought it best to rely on human nature to reveal and moderate the motives of the various office holders. The best way to resolve a political dispute, as James Madison put it, is to allow ambition to counteract ambition. In the most serious cases of disputes between the political branches, the legislature has the power to impeach the president. In such circumstances, the adjudication of the dispute is in the public arena, and both sides can make their case to the public. Consequently, it's not the courts that decide the outcome. Rather, to establish the legitimacy of government, the people must decide. It was meant to be the people would determine who's right when the two branches come to odds that can't be reconciled among the branches themselves. That's what impeachment was meant to be. By the end of the 20th century, it appeared to be the case that American politics could no longer be structured by the ordinary or practical operation of separation of powers. Rather, the actual conduct of the political branches of government was shaped by the ongoing necessity of accommodating and ratifying the actions of rational or administrative bureaucracy. In other words, it was an element of government itself, the bureaucracy, which had established the purpose and unity of the political branches, and with the blessings of the court and Congress. In short, after nearly half a century of its growth, the bureaucracy has become the conservative defender of the liberal or administrative state. Once established, the bureaucracy and political forces beholden to it have sought to progressively replace politics by substituting administrative rulemaking for general lawmaking and rule by technical or rational knowledge in place of political choices made by elected officials. In short, the political rule of law gives way to executive or administrative discretion. In our time, both political branches of government, and in some ways both parties, have accommodated themselves to the administrative state. Much greater authority resides in the administrative realm, under executive control. Most often, as I've said, with the blessings and meddling of both Congress and the courts. The growth of the administrative state has made it possible to politicize the culture by undermining the institutions of civil society, including the family, church, and nearly all private associations. That transformation was not brought about politically, but administratively, through the bureaucracy and the courts. Whether that transformation would have been possible politically if it had required Congress to pass legislation that required a majority consensus is very doubtful. Without a partisan political consensus, it was almost inevitable. Those political divisions would accelerate because they could never be adjudicated in a manner compatible with democratic consent when decided by the bureaucracy and the courts. You could see, as Ben Sass pointed out at Kavanaugh hearing, the courts now are understood to be policymakers because Congress refuses to make laws. So, nonetheless, let me say, the various national organized interests, whether political, economic, social, media, entertainment, educational, scientific, cultural, or religious, were well equipped to accommodate themselves to the centralized administrative rule. Moreover, they continue to be well served by Washington in terms of access to the political branches and the bureaucracy. But it is not clear the American people are convinced that government now operates on behalf of a public or common good. For that reason alone, the administrative state has not been able to establish its legitimacy. But the difficulty of revitalizing political rule in a manner compatible with constitutional government remains the problem yet to be solved. And looking back at Watergate after 40 years, what did it reveal? At the time, I thought it important to look at the institutional structure and the incentives of those that had become part of the modern administrative state. I attempted to show the importance of the bureaucracy as an institution that could utilize its influence on behalf of one political branch or the other. The necessity to preserve those administrative structures had become essential to modern government. Legitimacy was understood in terms of the administrative state and not the Constitution or even the nation itself. It led many within those organizations to consider institutional loyalty as fundamental to the defense of democratic government itself. You can notice that the people who, whether it was the FBI agents or the various people who thought that they had the moral authority to defend their institution, they were not even apologetic about what they were doing. They were arrogant in the defense of those institutions. And that is because they believe those institutions establish a government that is defensible for the reasons that the administrative state is defensible. For that reason, of course, the nonpartisan character of bureaucracy, its avowed neutrality, could not even any longer be taken for granted by those in political office. The permanent government had become a defender of the administrative state, a faction on behalf of government that could no longer be regulated by government. It was many years after Watergate that we learned the identity of the source of the leaks that led to a removal of a president. It was not surprising to me that Deep Throat, although I certainly didn't know it at the time, the source for Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein turned out to be a high-level direct official of the FBI. Mark Felt had access to all of the classified information generated by the agencies of government. He leaked that information selectively to the Washington Post over the course of a year or more. Woodward and Bernstein, through leaks, helped shape public opinion in ways the prosecution could not because of their necessity for secrecy. Remember, even the defense of Nixon had no knowledge of what the prosecution was doing. So, although Woodward and Bernstein were lauded as investigative reporters, they served merely as a conduit by which the bureaucracy could undermine the authority of an elected officeholder. And as I said, if Jeff Shepard is right in his revelations concerning the real Watergate scandal, the legal community, including the courts, the prosecutors, and even the judges, were willing to forego the procedural requirements that establish the necessary conditions of impartiality or fairness. They had all become active partisans in opposition to Nixon. So all of the neutral or supposedly the nonpartisan branches of government have participated in a sense, establishing themselves as adjuncts of the administrative state and no longer understand their role constitutionally. In modern organizations, those who work in the administrative structures often understand their interest in terms of institutional loyalty and their professional association, rather than the larger public good, understood in terms of the rule of law, the nation, or the Constitution. In short, the bureaucracies have developed the instinct for self-preservation at all costs. They do not, however, defend themselves on the basis of self-interest, nor do they think of themselves as scoundrels by breaking the law. Rather, they see themselves as defenders of institutional rationality, technical rationality that's established in these nonpartisan, non-political institutions, as a part of the social intelligence that establishes the legitimacy of rule within the administrative state. For many, the moral authority of the rational state has replaced that of the Constitution and undermined the law and the rule of law, both of which must be established and defended by political, not legal authority. Theodore White, who was a great chronicler of presidential elections, noted in his attempt to explain the politics that grew out of the election of 1972, he put it this way, and I quote, "The Watergate affair is inexplicable in terms of older forms of corruption in American history, where men broke laws for private gain or privilege. The men involved were involved at a moment in 1972 when history was moving their way. They were trying to speed it up by any means, fair or foul. By so doing, perhaps they wrecked their own victory. And then, as history may record, as history may record, compounds their personal felonies with national tragedy." Now, Theodore White knew what we all knew then. It is debatable whether Nixon had history on his side, as White asserts in 1972, but there was no doubt that he had adversaries who opposed his view of what should be done in Washington. Those adversaries in the political arena did not attempt to establish their legitimacy with reference to the electorate, nor had they sought to utilize the constitutional powers to oppose the president. Rather, they depended upon those institutional forces of the permanent government, including the bureaucracy, the courts, and mass media, to undermine Nixon's support within the electorate. I don't think it's possible to separate politics and laws, but it is possible to hold those who make laws accountable to the people. In establishing the judicial or the bureaucracy or whatever of the nonpartisan institutions as the arbiter of the political, the guardians are only accountable to themselves and those they serve, which is typically the establishment. In the public arena, scandal serves only a political purpose. Whether it succeeds or not is dependent upon who establishes its meaning. Regardless of the truth that has been revealed by the labors of those who have re-examined the scandals of the past, including some of the speakers you've had, I'm afraid they will have little political impact on the meaning of those scandals. In the end, I would say, when the legend becomes fact, they will continue to print the legend. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marini. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you.
Should the FBI be separated from the Department of Justice?
I don't know if it should be separated. I think what you see with the way in which it's controlled politically, in other words, when political appointees or political partisans establish the control over it, it uses its a law enforcement function on behalf of partisan purposes. I would say the FBI, perhaps there's a role for the FBI in national public life, but the CIA, which was established just to accommodate the conditions of the Cold War should have been disbanded at the end of the Cold War. These two agencies have great power, CIA and FBI, and they seem to cooperate with each other as well. And you notice the only agency in the recent year, in the last, since 2016, that did not go along with the Washington establishment in the way in which Trump was treated was Mike Rogers, who's an admiral and was head of the National Security Agency. He's a military security. He's the one that told Trump that he was being bugged. And that's when Trump moved out of the Trump tire. This was after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated. Just think if Trump had not known this was happening, he would have been in a worse situation than Nixon almost, because he hadn't even won an important, a big, decisive victory. So I don't know what you do. I think, you know, the FBI and these agencies, they certainly have to be under better control. When these people start leaking, when they start getting perks from the media and the news organizations as part of their job, they become corrupted as any human beings can be under those circumstances. So whether the FBI is needed, I think you probably need a police force in the modern world, even at the national level. But I think the FBI was always a force for powerful partisans. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was not an opponent of the country, but he was very careful about how he conducted his affairs, and it wasn't always in line with the political figure. So I don't know. I don't have a recommendation as to what could be done with it.
We have a question on the speaker's left.
What's your advice to the Trump legal team? To play the legal game or just deny requests for interviews, interrogatories, and simply say, use the Constitution and the impeachment avenue. I will not participate in these legal proceedings.
Well, you know, that would be a tactic you could take if you had partisan support in your own party, which Trump does not seem to have the leadership of his party behind him. And so it makes it a lot harder for Trump to ignore those things because he's not sure he's going to get support from his own party on these questions. And so if he demands impeachment, will his party support him in the legislature? What you have right now, I think, in Washington is you have a Washington establishment that likes the way business is done in Washington. That's true of both parties. And they want to preserve the way that business is done. And Trump poses a threat to the way it's done. And so, of course, they're not too happy to, you know, had he been a normal candidate for the presidency, they would have been on board after he won the nomination. And if he had run in 2016 with partisan support of his party throughout the electorate, because he made it became very difficult for members of Congress to oppose, to have Trump, to embrace Trump when the National Party wasn't embracing him. And if they'd have done that in 2016, many of those candidates now would be much better shape in 2018. The midterm for Trump would be much better, because normally midterms you lose seats anyway. But Trump is establishing a new political landscape, so it's not clear what the landscape's going to be, but it certainly would have been easier, like in my state of Nevada, when the Republicans didn't embrace Trump in 2016. That election led to the Democrats winning the offices because it diffused all of Trump's supporters' enthusiasm. They did not want Republicans in office that would not even support Trump publicly. So now in 2018, they're much more hospitable, those candidates in Nevada, but it's a little late, and so you've now got the opposition party mobilized too on behalf of things that are going to be harder to to overcome. But again, I think that's a very unusual situation to be in, because normally the institutions are organized by parties, and the party that you're a part of should support you. But it's not clear that some of the leadership of the Republican Party is any less hostile than many of the Democrats.
On the speaker's right.
Thank you. I found your talk very enlightening and a little depressing. Since you made that statement that Admiral Rogers was the only one that told Trump,
Yeah.
where is the uncorruptible man? Is it in the military?
Well, I think, let's say the military probably has a better connection to the country than those who are in the civil institutions. In other words, for Rogers, it's probably, you look at these office holders now in Washington, it's not even clear that they prefer this country to other countries. I mean, so when you have to reestablish a ground of the defense of the nation, when the offices that give legitimacy to these positions are flaunted in the sense that they don't even care who elects them once they get the office, then of course that's a much more difficult problem. And that's what you have with this present state. And particularly, I think this becomes a bigger problem at the end of the Cold War. It would have been impossible for any national leader during the Cold War to not defend his own nation and the offices established by that nation and given legitimacy by the electorate of that nation. When you can't even distinguish really between who is a legal resident, who isn't, those things don't seem to matter too much.
We have a question in the back for the speaker.
Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Marini. I am a sophomore here at Hillsdale, and like my fellow students, we really only know about Watergate from the history books and from people like you sharing about it with us. But as we hear about the Trump administration, and there's always this threat from the other side about impeachment, I can't help but think about Watergate. When you hear these threats of impeachment in the news, does it concern you in the way that maybe it did when Watergate was happening? Do you think it's legitimate and could actually result in impeachment? Or do you think it's just media hype trying to scare people into thinking it's a Watergate situation?
No, I think there's many similarities, because scandal and trying to remove one from office without impeachment is a much easier way. But, impeachment means that the people still remain a major force in politics. They would prefer not to have the people remain a major force in politics. And so that makes it, so yes, I think the whole necessity that I think there have been, since the administrative state was put in place, and that happened only, especially after the 1964 election, when Congress reorganized itself and became really an oversight rather than a legislative body. There have been 3 presidents who have understood the necessity of trying to keep the connection between the political offices and the electorate. In other words, the government has to be ratified and legitimized by the consent of the governed. That means elections decide things. And of course, those 3 presidents who have recognized consent as fundamental were Nixon, Reagan, and it seems to be Trump now. And you notice Trump is a guy who, when he went and ran, he says when he won, on the basis of how he ran, he tries to actually put into effect what he ran on. That's kind of unusual in modern politics, because they all run the same way in terms of saying to the organized groups what they want to hear. But the minute they get office, they've forgotten what they said, because it was meaningless in the first place. So the presidents who have accommodated themselves best to the administrative state have been all the recent presidents. First, Clinton, using, of course, many ways of being, when Clinton said the era of big government is over, he wasn't lying. What he meant was, this is now going to be the era of big administration. The use of executive power, the use of the various tools of executive power, like executive orders, signing statements, all kinds of ways, which Bush himself, George W. Bush, did the same thing. Obama did the same thing in terms of the use of executive administrative power. And it seems to me Trump is trying to reestablish more of an executive political power, and he's demanding that Congress start doing some things. And in fact, remember, for the last 20 years or so, Congress did not even follow its own regular order. It always ended up having omnibus or reconciliation bills just before the fiscal year required it. And in doing that, of course, they made decisions only with the leadership of of both parties and the president and the executive branch leadership. As Harry Reid once said, there's about 15 or 18 people in Washington that make the decisions. And that's wasn't far wrong. But this year, Trump has now pushed Congress. They've actually passed, I believe, 7 appropriations bills. They're trying to get regular order back. Trump keeps telling them, you should be doing these things. The Congress should be passing laws. They should be doing the things that are necessary. The executive orders are not a good way of governing, because that can be reversed by the next executive, as of course Trump has not been immune from using it, because it was so abused by the former presidents that he's starting to use executive orders to undermine the executive orders that Obama used. But if you want to do it right, you've got to pass laws. You've got to get an agreement. You've got to get a consensus. And when it works, when the policies work, of course, then it's harder for the next party or whoever wins to change things. So you have kind of, at the present, you have people who win office campaigning for office, and they keep their presidency is like an ongoing campaign, because nobody's agreed to anything. There's no consensus on anything in Washington that's done by elections. What that means, though, of course, is that the consent of the governed doesn't matter too much to them.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. There are many areas where I hardly agree with you, and many areas where I heartily disagree with you, which I believe is good for critical thought.
Yeah, sure.
What I gained from what you had in your presentation, along with last night. Now, in my position, I'm more from a liberal bent.
Yeah.
But the resignation of President Nixon and what went on after that was a huge travesty of justice. And my wife and I had quite a animated discussion on it on the way home last night. And we both came to that conclusion that there were wrongs that happened, but did it come from a large political group, or did this come from a more focused group with a judge who needed to make a name for himself before he retired, and then people he gathered around him, everybody agreeing on the purpose of personal gain, where there was no guidance of any internal moral compass, but each person within this group decided they were going to work for their own edification and honor. How would you treat that?
Well, obviously, I agree that there are many personal motives that are necessary to try to understand some event. My focus then was trying to understand what the institutional incentives were. Because most people in government now work within structures. These structures are already established and they do business in a certain way. And so those institutional structures and those institutional incentives make it easier to do certain kinds of things. It would have been impossible if all you had was integrity in terms of believing that the judicial system had to function in an impartial way no matter who was before you. If you make the moral decision that Nixon was beyond the pale, then of course you've already repudiated or you've denied the necessity of the rule of law. So I think when I tend to look at these things, I have looked at them from the point of view of how the incentives of the way in which modern government is conducted has established individual incentives which make it possible for those people to do what you're suggesting, to break the laws, break the rules. It's easier to break rules too if you don't believe that the moral character of the regime is justified as well, right? If you think the regime is corrupt and you think that the goal of the regime is to establish government as it has been established by the various liberal presidents of the 20th century, then of course it's easier then to ignore those devices that are meant to ensure that people who hold offices cannot use those offices on behalf of personal goals. And yet, I don't see how you can separate the self-interest of an individual and their perception of what a public good is, what the public interest is. And so, yeah, as I said about the American founders, they always assumed that you would be looking out for your self-interest. But they also assumed, of course, that there would be debates over what the public good or the common good is. So you would, look, if Congress is the body that is meant to deliberate on these policies that establish the general laws of this country, when Congress refuses to legislate, it essentially says, we don't have a public discourse about what should be good policy in this country. When Congress refused to do its job, which was to legislate, to deliberate, all of the things that the legislative body does and should do, simply to establish a consensus. What do you do with all those decisions that they don't make? They're made by courts. So is it easier to settle a political issue by having, say, 5 people on the Supreme Court make a moral decision about this or that, abortion, or any other policy question that is divisive in the country? Those problems never get solved. Now, if you have the possibility of mobilizing majorities and minorities come together trying to lobby Washington and Congress to get laws that are acceptable to large numbers of people, when you do get that kind of consensus, it's easier then for people to live with the outcome of laws, even if they disagree with it, because they've participated in them. What you're talking about, and you're right, I think the only people that have an advantage in the American system now are organized interests. And that's I don't just mean economic, I mean every interest. There's no interest in this country that doesn't have some apparatus in Washington that establishes the viewpoint of that as fundamental to how it wants certain kinds of outcomes in the policy arena. Now, if you went back just to 1964, I mean, if you went to Washington in 1964, you would find that there were no economic interests lobbying Washington, because you still had to lobby Albany or Sacramento, because the states controlled a great deal of the activity that went on in this country. Once you centralize all of that, it becomes easier. It becomes easy for the centralized those people that are able to lobby Washington to create a universal policy that is established everywhere. And so it's a lot easier for them to be influential in one place than having to be trying to influence politics in 50 states. Nixon's main goal in 1972, if you read all the speeches leading up to it, and if you read his memoirs, was how do we get administrative power out of Washington? That was what he was trying to do. And that's one of the few things that would make centralized administrative rule more difficult. Because the more centralized it is, the more professional it becomes as well. And I mean by that what establishes the authority for those decisions is technical knowledge, not politics. Now, some questions you can answer with technical or scientific knowledge, but political questions you can't. So it's a complex problem that is posed by the way in which modern governments establish their authority through these rational structures. And most kinds of organizations are happy to use that, but in a political organization, you can't allow rational rule to overrule political rule and still be a free people. So that's the...
Please join me in thanking Dr. Marini.